Welcome to Emotional Resilience, Living with the Fruit of the Spirit. I'm your host and author, Ron Ovid. Today we're in session 17, and we're going to start a series on knowing our emotional self. Now, I think that's pretty appropriate since we're what? Emotional resilience, right? Living with the fruit of the Spirit. But it helps, if we're going to be resilient, to know what in the world our emotions are all about. And so we're going to talk about how do we deal with them. We're actually going to get into the first two parts. When you think about it, we're going to talk about emotional recognition. We're also going to talk a little bit about regulation. We'll touch on, in some of it, a little bit about emotional learning, although a lot of that will be coming in future lessons. You know, we're emotional creatures. God created us that way, didn't he? And that's a good thing. I mean, can you imagine living in a world without love? And, it's an important. What about joy? And, of course, the fruit of the Spirit, right? Patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. God has created us emotional, and it's the spice of life when you think about it. But it can also get out of control. And so we want to talk about how do we deal with them? How do we deal with them when there's painful emotions, when there's things bothering us? And so we can live in that healthy emotional zone, and we want to talk a little bit about that. There's going to be 11 things that we want to consider. We're going to consider 5 of the points today in this lesson and 6 in the next. You know, we talk about the inner child, that emotional, what would you say, that emotional beginning of ourselves when we're children. It lays the foundation for many of the beliefs we have, and unfortunately, a lot of times they're immature, and then it causes in us, it causes in us all kinds of emotional reactions. We have both hemispheres of the brain that we talked about when we studied about the brain, the right and the left, and we need the integration of that in order to be mature. And so step 1, part 1 here, and you can get the notes. If you don't have the notes, you're listening to this on video, and you don't have the notes, you can get them simply by asking for them, session 17, and write me at ron@empowerministry.org, and I'll be happy to send them to you. Otherwise, you're probably in a group listening to this, and I encourage you to read the notes ahead of time if you can, and then stay around for group discussion where you can really learn these things. Well, number 1 is that learn when we're having an immature emotional reaction, right? We're creatures of habits, and a lot of times we don't even recognize that some of our reactions are immature because it's our norm. It's how we've always acted. Maybe it was modeled for us. And so we have these immature reactions sometimes, and we need to start to be able to recognize it, right? We want to be able to recognize it where we can start to overcome them. Now, one way to do that is to look in hindsight. Boy, when did I go off the reservation, right? When did I over-emote? And use that as a case study, if you will, and look at it. How did you react? How did others react to it? What triggered it? When did it start? How long did it last? Be your own emotional detective. You need to be your own detective. You need to look at it. You know, what was the modus operandum? What was the motive? You know, how did it work out? You know, so you can learn about yourself emotionally. And you want to recognize, you know, what road are we on? Because when we're talking about emotions, a lot of times we'll talk about a high road and a low road processing of our emotions. And so if we can recognize when we're going into a low road instead of a high road, it will help us come back. We can return to joy and peace and patience. High road, mature processing, is a higher form of processing using reflective thought processes, okay, instead of just reflexive. Low road would be reflexes. I'm just reacting, right, or reactive, if you will. This is reflective, and that's why we want to catch ourselves. We want to recognize it where we can regulate it, and then we can be reflective. It's a flexible and resilient. It uses that prefrontal cortex of the brain where we have a lot of things. You know, Daniel Siegel's done some work on that, and he's came up with 9 different things that the prefrontal cortex does. It regulates our body functioning. It helps us with attuned communication. It balances our emotions. It helps us pause before acting. Boy, that would help, wouldn't it? It gives us empathy toward others. It helps us get insight. It modulates our fear response. It gives us intuitive feel for what's going on, and it helps us behave morally. I mean, God has given us this incredible brain and this prefrontal cortex that we can use. But when we're using the back part of the brain in that limbic area, we're not doing it. And so we need to learn when we're getting into the low road. And that low road, that immature processing, is a lower form of processing used by like I said, the primitive or the back part of our brain, if you will. That includes the brain stem, the visceral feedback from the body, the emotional part of the brain, the limbic area, the amygdala that we studied. And when we sense, it comes through our senses, a threat, then what happens, we sense a threat, and it comes from maybe some unresolved trauma in the past. It could be an intrinsic memory that's out of our awareness, and all of a sudden we're triggered. We react then by shutting down the higher processing. We shut it down, and instead we rely on an intense emotion, impulsive reactions, and repetitive responses. Doesn't that sound a lot like craving, right? Doesn't it sound a lot like panic attacks or OCD? It's repetitive, it's impulsive, it's intense. The low road ignores self-reflection, consideration of consequences, and other points of view. We end up looking for all sorts of negative ways to regulate our emotional pain and what we call escapes, right? That overindulgence in excitement or substance, compulsive behavior, avoidance, people, emotionalism, sex, and we, instead of being moderation, we overdo it and we try to escape from it. And so the first step is to recognize when we're on that. Are we on the high road or low road? How are we responding? How do we get back? The second is to, that stop and pause, what that prefrontal cortex can help us with. We want to learn to rate and monitor our emotions. If we can name it, we can tame it. We'll talk about that in the next one because we want to have more of an emotional literacy. But in the sense here, if we can see where we are, if we can monitor it, we can move it. All right? If we can monitor it, we can move it up and down the scale. Hypoarousal, is that low 1, 2, maybe 3. Hyper is that more 9 and 10, right? And so, emotions run on a range. We were made that way. There's times to be afraid, and then there's times to be really afraid, right? And yet we can go to an extreme maladaptive emotion in the case of panic, right? Terror, freeze. In anger situations, we could get frustrated, mad, but we could also, rage. And so we have to measure, where are we? Where are we? Hypoarousal is that low emotion like depression, lethargic, self-loathing, detached from our emotional, a flat affect. That hyperarousal is that high emotion, anxious, edgy, caged in, angry, vehement, unregulated emotion. Those are the ones that we want to bring back toward the middle. Bring back more toward the middle. And we need to be able to regulate it. It's key. It's key. We need to be able to regulate these where we can start owning our emotions and dealing with them. A lot of times it comes from an implicit memory, something that's out of our awareness. You may have been traumatized when you were younger, and let's say someone beat you up, and they had, they were an older kid, they had a red jacket, red hair, and it was a dark night in an alley. Well, what do you think is going to happen when you're, maybe 40 years old, you're looking for a house, you can't find it, you're in the city, and you drive up in an alley, and it's dark, and it's windy, just like that night, and all of a sudden, there comes a guy with that same color coat, red hair. What do you think is going to happen for that instant? Well, all of a sudden, you're going to feel this panic, right? Even though you're an older, mature person now, you're going to go right back to that time. Why? And you don't know, you aren't even going to know why necessarily. because it was out of awareness, but the amygdala remembered. And we have a lot of those where our brain thinks we need to stay away from danger, and a lot of times it's built on a false assumption. The false assumption there in that case would be, hey, I'm 8 years old and I got beat up. Well, you're not 8 years old now. You're sitting in a car, you're 40 years old, you've got a cell phone next to you, you got all kinds of options. But you're acting like an 8-year-old, you see. And so how do we bring it back down? How do we get that front part of the brain to work? And so that's what we need to do. And so when you're having an emotional episode, you can ask yourself, what was I feeling? What did I feel was true about me in that moment? You know, I'm not going to die because there's a guy in the alley down there, right? Upon reflection, what's the truth, right? What's the truth? The truth about me, the situation, and that kind of reflection can a lot of times bring us out. Well, what I mentioned a moment ago, I'll mention now in number 3, a lot of times we need to learn a more precise emotional language. A lot of times we only have certain names for how we're feeling. And the old adage is, if you can name it, you can tame it. And a lot of times we're trying to calm down. Oh, you know, I'm a rageaholic. Well, really? Or are you frustrated and you're acting like you're over angry, you see? And you know, many of our deep emotions ruminate over and over in our head, our thoughts and self-talk moving so fast it can often be confusing and full of misleading assumptions, beliefs, and thoughts. And so a lot of times, you know, we're not thinking rationally and we're emoting. And we need to stop a lot of times and really think, okay, what's going on? And if we can have a better language, if we can explain what some of our emotions are, we can react better. For example, you know, I have in your notes there a whole list. I've taken love and joy and fear and anger and surprise and sadness and neglect and sympathy, and I've taken those words, and to the right I've added a lot of others. You know, I mean, for example, you know, we say the same language. Boy, I love chocolate. Man, I really love my wife. Well, we can assume that we mean different kinds of love there, right? That would be rational. But maybe there's a fondness. Maybe I like chocolate. You know, maybe I, you know, really, you know, have a craving for it. But then, you know, there's other words like compassion, sentiment, you know, sentimentality, right? Tenderness. And same thing with joy. You know, there's enthusiasm, bliss, gaiety, but, you know, there's also, you know, being satisfied, being gratified, and it helps us if we can sometimes name our emotions. When you talk about fear, there's horror, you know, there's helplessness, there's hopelessness, there's dread, there's apprehension, there's worry. I mean, you see the difference? And when we can fine-tune it, we can tame it better. In anger, there's, you know, aggravation, there's outrage, there's revulsion, there's jealousy and greed. I mean, you know, different words can put different kinds of meaning on it so we can think more logically about it. I remember I was afraid to admit about some anger I had because I kept thinking of a rage, and I wasn't a rageaholic. And then one day I was thinking about it, I thought, boy, what about frustration? And yeah, I do get frustrated. And so I started to learn to deal with frustration. And that really, really helped me when I named it. And I thought, okay, what's going on? I was able to get rid of false guilt and all these other things that stopped me from working on it and zero in on this frustration. And what's going on here? And I was able to work more with it. So if we can name it, we can tame it. And you might want to go through that list and start circling some of the emotions that you feel a lot, that is common to you where you can do it. And so we identify, are we on a high or low road? We try to rate it, our emotions where we are. We name them. And the fourth thing is that we go from then the low road, processing that immaturity, to a high road. And so we move, right? And so we move from one to the other. And so we need to look at some of the elements. In the low road, right, it's usually set off by a trigger. Something triggers us. Now, it could be something that's fully in our awareness. It could be something that we're not sure. God gives us a certain look. And normally, that might not bother us, but maybe we've given that person power. And so when they look at us like this, we want to react back. And it could be that we're reacting to someone in the past, right? Someone else had treated us that way, and our brain goes off. So we need to be able to identify our triggers. You know, what are some of the things that are triggering us where we can work with them? We can analyze them. And then we want to be able to make a transition, right? We want to be able to make a transition. We want to catch that. We go from a trigger into all of a sudden where we transition into a low road behavior. And what we want to be able to do is transition from there and say, okay, what's going on? Calm down, right? We want to start to regulate it. We do that through breathing. We do that through grounding. We'll spend a whole bunch of time on how do we regulate our emotions. But if we can notice the triggers, then we can transfer, right? We can make a transition into the high road, go from the low road back up to the high road, okay? And if we can learn to recognize them, the cues, the triggers, and stop the reacting to it, we can go ahead and then bring that reaction. You know, we can ask for God's help, right? Lord, help me in this. Lord, make me aware of this. Help me respond. We can call up other people. We can talk about it, and then we can try to resolve the issue. And so, you know, we start to learn. And what are some of the things we can, you know, what are some of the low roads that we need to be aware of? Well, escaping, right? Like I said, overindulgence in excitement and substance, compulsive behavior, avoidance, people pleasing, right? Emotionalism, sex, you know. Are we using these things to escape? Well, that's low road behavior. Let's catch ourselves. You know, it may be habitual, we're not even paying attention, but we know. And we got to ask God and say, Lord, help me. Maybe we need counseling. Maybe we need to talk to some people. But let's start looking at the way we escape and start crying out to God and start finding help for these things. Another one is isolation, right? Isolation, and that's a kiss of death. We learn and change in relationships with God, relationships with each other. And if we're isolating, then that's low road behavior. And then negative rumination. You know, are we constantly being negative? Are we pessimistic? Are we, you know, is the glass always half empty? You know, are we always down on ourselves? Are we depressed? You know, the same old sad story over and over again. What stories are we telling? We need to catch ourselves in that negative rumination. And then some of the choices we make. Some of the choices that we make that aren't healthy for us, that lead to habitual negative behavior, we need to catch some of those things where we can change, And so what are some things that we can do? What are some high road methods that we can do to deal with that kind of impulsiveness and low road behavior? Well, one thing is when it starts to happen, fast forward the movie, right? You know, when the Titanic came out, I already knew the ending. And so did you, right? Well, frankly, when we get into low road behavior, we know what the ending's going to be. We've played it out before. It doesn't end well. Fast forward it. Realize, hey, there's consequences to what I'm doing here, where we can stop and get the help we need. Another thing is get healthy. You'll be surprised how many of these things are habitual because our body's not reacting in the way it should. Are we eating right? Are we exercising? Are we sleeping? It's amazing to me how many people are not sleeping that 7 to 8 hours a night that they should get. And they keep going and going, overworking, you know, and they're not getting the rest they need. Sleep is very important. Exercise, getting out and walking, moving around, eating healthy, all those things are important. And then there's prayer and meditation. It's amazing to me how many people that go to church aren't reading the scriptures and meditating on God's word. They're not praying. They're not talking to God. They're not repenting and talking to him and confessing sin and then rejoicing and praising God for the things that are going. They're not full of gratitude. We need those kinds of spiritual helps to help us. And then listening for and correcting the lies that we're believing. What are we believing? You need to be the detective that asks yourself, what's the motive? What's going on? Why did they do that? What was I believing about myself, maybe about others? The consequences. What was I fearing if that was the case? And then we need healthy relationships. If all our relationships are toxic, then nothing's going to improve. We need to have healthy relationships. We need other people with healthy, mature brains that will interact with our brain and help our brain learn how to respond better. We need good, healthy fellowship. And then a lot of times we need that professional help. We need someone that can listen to us, someone that knows about these things, someone that's going to have that unconditional love for you and listen and challenge you and help you get insights that will set you free. It's worth it. You know, if you broke your car broke down, you'd pay $400, $1,000, $2,000 to get it to go again. Aren't you worth more than that? Aren't you worth what the counseling might cost to get the help that you need? And then finally, number 5, we need to learn to focus. We need to learn to focus on what's going on. You know, so many times we're just reacting and we're not focusing. And, we need to focus. And that's a habit. We need to be able to sense what's going on in our body. You'll be surprised how you can learn to focus. You can learn to have a narrow focus. How many? Can I hear 5 different things right now? When I pick up an object, can I feel the different kinds of things about it? If I look at it, is it shiny or dull? When I feel with my eyes closed, is it rough or smooth? Is it soft or hard? Is it hot or cold? Learning to really tune into our senses. And then there's also, that ability to relax, to focus on just to be able to quiet the inner chatter, to be able to relax, bringing into our attention that God loves me, that, I'm loved by God, I'm loved by others, that I am significant, that I am lovable. Those things that are so true for you that you might not even believe, but you need to start owning. And then as we do that, we focus on those things. We focus on gratitude. We focus on, positive thinking, praying and talking to God about these things. You'll learn to bring it down. And as we focus on where we are, like we started out on that arousal scale, and learning to bring ourselves, returning to joy. We have choices today. We don't have to stay there. If we're depressed, we can start to work on feeling better. If we're real hyper, we can learn to relax. And we'll talk more about that as we go on. And so we need to learn to bring ourselves down from that hyper-arousal. It doesn't help that we all walk around with phones all the time and doing all this social media, and we're so used to being interrupted and having focused on these things and having a million things going on at a time. We need to learn to relax. We need to learn to bring it down. We need to become an expert in relaxing. And we think, well, let's just soothe ourselves, but there's so many false soothers that really don't help. Just turning on the TV and vegging on TV, that's not relaxation. Eating junk food, it may comfort you for a while, but that's not the kind of relaxation we need. Sharing our negative experiences with others, rushing into the next activity, drinking to calm us down, taking a joint. So many people try to use drugs to do that. That's not going to help us. and, jump into some other kind of addictive behavior, gambling, porn, internet games. Addiction isn't going to help us. Instead, there are positive ways. We can spend time visualizing about ourselves, right? Living happy and being joyful, being relaxed, and then actually practicing the relaxation. Reading the scriptures and talking to God, meditating on His Word, breathing, practice breathing. And we'll talk, like I said, more about that when we're going to get into emotional regulation. Going for a walk out in nature, just sensing the beauty all around us and the magnificence of God as we're taking a walk and a stroll. Listening to relaxing music, taking a bath or a shower, spending time with pets or with plants, all those kind of things can help us relax. Well, in closing, let me read something here. We'll get into 6 through 11 in the next class. And I encourage you to read this over a little bit more, get to know some of these things, start to think about these things, become that expert, right, on relaxation, become that expert on your own emotions. But this is what Dr. Benner said in his book, Surrender to Love. He said the key to spiritual transformation is meeting God. Our natural inclination is to bring the most presentable parts of ourself to the encounter with God. But God wants us to bring our whole self to the divine encounter. He wants us to trust Him enough to meet perfect love in our vulnerability of our shame, weakness, and sin. Trevor Hudson describes conversion as a continuing process that unfolds one day at a time as we bring more and more of ourselves to God. Tragically, however, most of us have large tracts of our inner world that are excluded from God's transforming love and friendship. Our fearful, angry, and wounded parts of self can never be healed unless they're exposed to divine love. This is why we must meet God's love in our vulnerability and brokenness, not simply our strength and togetherness. Only as we do so can our damaged and infirm parts of self be exposed to transforming love. But it also requires that we stay long enough in His loving presence to allow our shame to begin to melt away. For love to transform us, not only must we meet in vulnerability, we must also linger long enough for it to penetrate our woundedness. I encourage you to read that again. It's powerful. We need to take that time to really, really change. And I've put in the end of the exercise some biblical calming truths. God gives me peace, and He delights in me, and I won't lose heart. And I've put different scriptures there that you can read. I can put my trust in God. I won't be afraid. And so I trust that God will continue to help us now as we become that detective on who we are emotionally, and we start to regulate it. Next week, we'll continue 6 through 11.